Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. This is your American literature subject, and in this we have done a number of different genres of literature. We've done essays, we've done short stories. If you remember, we started off with Emerson's essay on self-reliance, and we went on to do a couple of short stories. What we're doing right now is poetry. We've already done a few poems, and today I'm going to try to wind up the poetry section. I'm not going to go over what we did in the last lecture for the simple reason that the lectures on poetry are what you would call self-contained. If a poem is being repeated or carried on from the previous lecture, then yes, I will recap. But since we're doing American literature as a whole, and my aim is to introduce you to as many different genres of literature within the broader heading of American literature as it is possible in this limited time frame. So what we will be doing today is a few poems, and these are by different poets. We've already done a few poems, and the longest one was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. I'm going to start today with poems of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, some of you may know, was somewhat of a recluse. She didn't meet many people, and the poems she wrote can be categorized into a few broad categories. There are poems that are written about life, and then there are poems that are written about death. Most of Dickinson's poems are very short poems, and you'll see how short they are when we start doing them. So the one that we're going to start off with is just given the number 13, and the subject of the poem you will understand once we read through them. So I'm going to read the short poems one by one, and as I read them, I'm going to explain them to you so that you don't have any problem in understanding and appreciating them. Okay, so here we go. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door on her divine majority, obtrude no more. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor is kneeling upon her mat. I've known her from an ample nation choose one, then close the valves of her attention like stone. Okay. Now, you see a very short poem, but one that is full of feeling, full of emotions. And the ideas that Dickinson presents, if they are not new, they are at least presented in a very novel manner. She starts off by saying the soul selects her own society. You know, we always say birds of a feather flock together, or like turns to like. And it's very true that when you meet people who have the same tastes, you automatically develop a bond with them. So the soul selects her own society. You cannot thrust your attention onto the soul. And whoever you like, or when you meet someone who has the same kind of taste, then you automatically bond with them. And once you bond with one person out of, let's say, 10 who might be present in the room, you automatically block out the others. And your conversation, your thoughts are limited to that one person with whom you have managed to develop a bond. So the soul selects her own society and then shuts the door, blocks out everyone else. On her divine majority, obtrude no more. So once the soul has selected one individual or one other soul, 1 and 1 makes not 2 but 11. So once the soul has selected another soul, that becomes the majority. It gets strength from having another soul joining it. And once that is done, then the rest of the world is shut out. Then the rest of the world is blocked off, and you no longer have any communication with other people. Obtrude no more. So even if you try to force yourself on the attention of another person, you will receive very cold rebuff, a very cold snub, because the soul has selected her own society, has selected the people that she wants to bond with, and the others do not count for her. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor is kneeling upon her mat. Okay, so position, power, wealth and riches, nothing has any impact once the soul has made its choice. Then you could have the richest person begging for your attention, begging to be made a part of that society, but the soul will not be impressed. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Now you see the comparison that Dickinson is making here is of the soul with her low gate on one side. On the other side you have the chariot. The chariot could have the champion. The chariot could have the richest man in the whole wide world. And the soul, in spite of its lowly station, will not admit the occupant of that chariot into the house. So riches have nothing to do with friendship. Wealth has nothing to do with relationships. Once a bond has been established, once a relationship has been established, that's it. There are no concerns with material wealth. There is absolutely no concern with worldly honor or worldly status, position, authority. Absolutely none. So unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing. You know, a rich man, a powerful man, could stop at her house, at the place where she has assembled her friends, and yet it would make no difference. So the two contrasts are, on the one side you have the chariot, and you know the chariot is a vehicle that is above the ground, whereas the low gate shows the lowly status of the soul. So power and position on one hand, and lack of wealth, lack of power on the other. In spite of that, there is no bonding, there is no mating. Unmoved, an emperor is kneeling upon her mat. So even if an emperor, the most powerful in the land, comes and kneels upon her welcome mat, kneels outside her door, she is still not impressed. You know, it's a big thing to have an emperor coming to your house. We who live in the era of VIP culture are very much aware of other people's power and positions. And if we see a powerful person wanting our friendship, we are very impressed, and there is a general tendency to accept that individual's friendship. But here Dickinson says the soul is absolutely unconcerned with power and with worldly positions. Worldly status, worldly authority does not really concern the soul. What the soul is concerned with is where it finds commonalities, where it is able to bond, where it sees other souls like itself. So even if an emperor were to come and kneel at her door, come and beg for inclusion into that small circle, into that small society, it would make absolutely no difference to the soul. I've known her from an ample nation choose one, then close the valve of her attention like stone. So it's like a stone that is rolled at the mouth of the cave. Dickinson says, I've known the soul to select one individual out of a whole nation, and that means one out of millions, and then close the valves of her attention. You know, valves can be shut and they can be open. They are open when you want liquid or gas to flow through. When you want to restrict their flow, then you turn off the valve. And once the valve has been turned off, once it's been closed, then gases or liquids cannot pass through. That is a given. So the soul does this. It selects one from a whole nation, not just from one family, not from a tribe, not from one caste or one class. It's the whole nation. Choose one, and then that's it. No more. So the soul does not want 100 or 1,000 people to communicate with. It needs one partner. Once it has selected that one partner, the rest of the world can go hang itself. The rest of the world does not make any difference. It doesn't matter. So Dickinson says, I've seen the soul doing this, undergoing this process of selection. And once an individual or a soul has been selected, for the rest, it is goodbye. Now, I want you to think about these ideas, because this is not a poem that advocates the making of many friends, but it concentrates on one person, one individual with whom it can bond, to the exclusion of everything else. Okay, let's go on to the next poem. And this one is titled Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Now, Dickinson's poems, like those of some other poets, do not have any titles. It's not like, let's say, Sylvia Plath, who gives titles to her poems. These are poems where the first line is taken to be the title. So the first line of this poem is, Because I could not stop for death. Let's go on. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Since then 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So the title is Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and Dickinson goes on to say, he kindly stopped for me. Now death is generally considered a female. Dickinson presents him as male. She presents him as a person, a human being who's driving a carriage. Now what you see here is a reflection of Dickinson's style. And in this short poem, she gives death some human characteristics, animates death, and presents death as a carriage driver. And she says, because I could not stop for death, you know, she was in such a hurry that she could not pause for death. He kindly stopped for me. So the whole scene that she presents here is like a movie, you know, with Emily Dickinson in a hurry trying to do as much work as possible in the short time, and not waiting for anyone, not stopping for anyone, but rushing on her way. And then she says, death kindly stopped for me. So I was rushing around, running around madly, and then death came in. And he came in a carriage. And when I sat in the carriage, I saw that there were only 3 people that the carriage held. And again, she's animating not just death, but also immortality. So she says the carriage held but just ourselves, that is death, Emily Dickinson, and immortality. So here you see even immortality has been given human characteristics. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. You know, once you're dead, nothing else seems to matter. And the same is true of this situation. Once Dickinson dies and death takes Dickinson away, Dickinson says that he didn't rush headlong. He drove very slowly because the world was behind us. I was in the companionship of death and immortality. So there was no hurry. You know, he was a very careful but a slow driver. Death had no concerns. Death had done what it wanted to. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So it's like a guest who comes to your house, and in order to honor that guest, in order to pay proper respect to the guest, you leave off your work and you give undivided attention to your guest. So Dickinson is in that position. She says that I put away all my work. Obviously, when you die, everything stays here and you go on alone into the next world. So, but Dickinson presents it in such a way that she says, you know, it was because I wanted to be courteous towards death that I put away everything else. All the work that I was doing, all the fun that I was having, all the family and friends I had accumulated throughout life, I put them all on one side because death had been so kind as to visit me. And when death wanted me to go out for a drive in the carriage, I agreed, you know, I had no choice. So in other words, she is making the most of a very scary situation in which death takes you away, and you're trying to look at this fact from a very positive point of view. So she says, I had put away everything. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. So it's a long journey. After death, some people think that once you die, that's it. It's the end of the world and nothing more is going to happen. Here, however, Dickinson says that it was a very long journey, and during that journey we passed by school. We saw the children playing there because school wasn't over yet. We passed fields where grain was growing, and I was very happy to see grain growing. And then we passed the setting sun. Now she's giving you these different examples to show that when one individual dies, the world goes on. The world does not stop for anyone. No one lives for another person. No one dies without another person. That's very, very important, and I want you people to remember this. No matter what you do, how much you have accomplished in this world, once you die, everything is left behind and you go on alone. So the world goes on, the crops grow, the farmers sow the seeds, children study, people go to work at all hours, maybe in the morning, maybe in the evening or at night time. The sun continues to rise and set, the moon waxes and wanes, you have storms, you have hurricanes, tornadoes. Everything goes on just the same. The only difference is you are not there. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Beautiful images Dickinson has brought here. She's talking about a grave and about a graveyard, a cemetery. And she says, we stopped for a short time before a house which didn't seem so much like a house as a swelling of the ground. You know, the shape of the grave, what we call the kachi grave, the one that doesn't have stone and tiles around it, that is just like a mound. So she says that this house, this ultimate residence, appeared to be like a mound on the ground, you know, a swelling of the ground. It didn't appear to be a house. And what was even worse was that you couldn't see the roof. You couldn't see the roof, and you thought that you entered the house, but the cornice, the place where you keep all those decoration pieces, was just a mound. So now these are very deeply emotional lines, and in these lines Dickinson is trying to share with us her experience of death, her comprehension of the phenomena of death. And while she's explaining this, she says that death is not what we imagine it to be. We imagine that when we die, people will cry and scream, and people will not be able to do any work. But that's just fallacy. That's just a misunderstanding. What happens once we die is that the world goes on. You wake, sleep, dance, sing, work, study, and do 100,000 other things. But the person who is dead does not come back. He or she stays dead. So, the roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Since then, 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Since the day she says she died, and you have to remember that she's imagining all this. Obviously you cannot write after you are dead, so she's imagining what will happen once she dies. And she says, it's been centuries since I died. But this time that has passed, these centuries that have passed, they feel shorter than that one day on which I realized that this is eternal life. The horses' heads were toward eternity. Remember, immortality is in the carriage with Dickinson. Death, immortality, and the poet, Dickinson, are riders in a carriage. And the day on which she realizes that this was the real life, that one day was longer than centuries of human existence put together. And hence the significance of this one day, or this one moment, in which it dawns on the poet that this is eternal life, and whatever was in the past is over and done with. The phenomenon that has to be looked forward to is eternity, is the eternal life, is the permanent life, not the transitory temporal life of this world, but the life hereafter. Okay? Now, let's go on to another poem, and this time this is a poem full of hope. And the title is, of course, the first line, hope is the thing with feathers. What is the thing with feathers? Obviously a bird that flies, a bird that is a sign of hope because it manages to soar. And you know, as long as you have hope, you can soar upward to the skies. So hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Okay. So hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. Hope is something that uplifts you, that gives a human being buoyancy. The pain, the agony, the troubles of this world weigh you down, depress you, make you unhappy. And in such circumstances, the only thing that lifts your spirits up is hope. Hope that this black period will come to an end, that this bleak time will ultimately end, and a new day will dawn. So hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So hope is eternal. As long as you have life, you have hope. And when you have no hope, you are dead, you are finished. So hope has been compared to a bird that perches in the soul and that never lets go. It keeps on singing, and for the bird, its life is in its song. It sings in all kinds of weather, it sings in all kinds of climates, it sings in all kinds of terrain. So the tune that the bird sings is without words. It's a song without words, and sweetest in the gale is heard. So when you have troubles, when you have afflictions, that is when hope is strongest. That is when the song of this bird called hope sounds the sweetest. You may have hurricanes, you may have gale force winds, you may have tornadoes, but hope is there because it perches in the soul. It's not somewhere outside your body. It's not in a place where gales can harm it. It's in a secure place in your soul. And because it has been likened to a bird, therefore Dickinson says the song that this bird sings is sweetest when you have the maximum amount of troubles, and that those troubles in fact trigger off the sweetest song, that trigger off the resurgence of hope in the human soul and in the human body. So sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. So this hope keeps you warm. When it is coldest, it supports you. It is a form of support, it's a form of warmth. And so Dickinson says, you know, it would have to be a very cruel storm. It would have to be a very harsh phenomenon of nature which would attack this little bird that perches in the soul, that does not harm anyone, and on the contrary, it keeps so many warm, it gives a sort of uplift to so many depressed people. What kind of a storm would actually try to suppress the work of such a creature? I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So the best thing about this creature, this hope, is that it doesn't ask anything of you. And because Dickinson is throughout comparing it to a bird, this bird does not even ask for breadcrumbs. It is self-sustaining. It does not want external resources. It's there. It perches in my soul. It has made my soul its home, its abode, and it does not need worldly food. It doesn't need money. It doesn't need anything material. It's there where you have the maximum unhappiness. It's there where it is coldest, chillest land. That is, it's there for the resurgence of souls and spirits when people are having the hardest possible time, when there are no friends, when there are no resources, yet hope is there. Hope lives there, because as long as there is life, there is hope. And in the direst of situations, hope remains without asking for any support. On the contrary, it lends support, it lends buoyancy to the soul or the spirit. So even in extreme circumstances, it does not ask a crumb of me. Now the next poem that we are going to be doing is by Robert Frost. It's a very famous poem. It's one of my favorite poems, and I know it's going to be your favorite poem too. So Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveller, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Let's go back to the beginning. Two words diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. Now, Frost, the poet, is at a point in his life where he sees two paths, two choices. He has to take one. He cannot take both. You know, when you're walking and you come at a crossroads, you have to decide whether you're going to go to the left or to the right. The road is diverging, is breaking out. Where do you go, left or right? And so Frost says, I couldn't travel both. You know, I couldn't split myself into two halves and have myself traveling on both roads. I had to make a decision. I had to decide for myself what I was going to do with my life. And so he says, long I stood and looked down one as far as I could. So what he's trying to do is see where this path leads and what he can see at the end of this road or at the end of this path. So he tries to look down it. Now remember that this is in a wood, so there's all that undergrowth and there's all those trees overhead. So when he looks at these two paths, he cannot see far. He can see for a short distance, but beyond that he cannot, because there's grass underfoot, there's the undergrowth, and there are the trees above. There are plants. He's in a wood, he's in a forest. And so he can only see up to a certain distance. So he looks at one and then he looks at another, and he cannot decide which path he's going to ultimately take. So the one that he does look at, he says, I could see down that path as far as it went straight, but when it bent in the undergrowth, when it curved, I couldn't see past that because there were so many trees, there was so much undergrowth. So I looked down this path, and then I looked at the other path, and they were equally beautiful. They had equal merit. You know, I couldn't decide whether I was to take the one on the right or the one on the left. So, but when I looked at the other, it seemed better to me. And why was it better? Because it was grassy. So there appeared to be more grass here than on the first path that I looked at. In other words, what Frost is trying to say here is that the majority of mankind had adopted one path. I looked at the other also, and what I saw was that very few people had walked down that path. The first path that I looked at, everybody had taken that path. Everybody had made that choice. The other choice that I was looking at did not appear to be that worn, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. Now there was a very little difference, you know, what they call a minuscule difference. But he stands there and he thinks of the choice that he must ultimately make. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. So for the time being, both paths looked fresh. It was morning, and as yet no travelers had come by. There were no people who were traveling or who had to make a choice. So I was the only one standing there, not knowing what to decide. The grass and the leaves that were underfoot, he says, no step had trodden black. You know what happens when you step on leaves or even on grass? You stop their ability to get oxygen from the air. You know that all kinds of plants, they breathe the same as human beings. So when you step onto them, you block off their oxygen supply. When you block off the oxygen supply, the plant or the grass or the leaves die. And when they die, they are converted into a liquid state. From solid, they become liquids because it turns into oil. Now this is oil of different kinds. But when this oil oozes from the leaves, and when oxygen is deprived to the leaves or the plants or the grass, they turn black. So he says that the time at which I was contemplating which road to take, both roads, both paths had fresh green leaves as a carpet, and those leaves had not started to turn black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. Now it's all very well to say that there are two things that you want to do. You'll do one today, the other tomorrow or next week or next month or next year. But that's not how it happens. Once you make a choice, then you get other options from that choice that you have taken. And Frost says that he realized that although he tried to convince himself by saying that I will not take this path today, I'll take the one that very few people have traveled, I'll make the choice that very few people have made, but one day I'm going to do this also. So he says, although I said that, I thought that, I knew that I was not going to come back. Whatever choice I made that day was going to be final. It was going to be final in the sense that, as he says, way leads on to way. You make one choice, and out of that choice, you have other options coming out. Now, when you have these other options coming out, you start on a journey from which there is no return. So Frost says, although this was the reassurance I was trying to give myself, I knew that once I had taken one path, I may not be able to come back and take the other path. For example, you who are studying literature and linguistics, at this point, you're in your final semester now, you will have to make a choice. You made a choice when you took admission in your MA program. Once you are finished with this MA program, you will have to make a choice. You might want to go into teaching. You might want to continue your studies, go on to do your MPhil and PhD. You might want to stay home, so get married, not do a job. You might want to go into the media with this degree and start writing there. Whatever you do is because of this choice that you made 2 years ago, and this choice was to do your MA in English. Now you were at a crossroads when you took admission in this program. You're going to be at a crossroads again once you finish your degree. Once this semester is over, you will be standing at a crossroads again, what to do. And whatever choice you make, your entire future depends on that choice. It depends to a great extent now, because with a degree in English, you are not going in for a degree in, let's say, political science or economics or history or sociology or so many other things. So already a lot of the things have been, let's say, removed from your list of considerations or list of possible employments. You can't say that now that I have done my MA in English, I'll go and take admission in a medical college or in an engineering university. You can't do that. You've made your choice and you have to continue with this. And while you are continuing with this, you have other choices, other options that open up before you, and you have to make decisions on what to do. You might say, okay, I'll do teaching for some time and then I'll start my MPhil. Once you start your teaching, it becomes very difficult to come back to studies. Whereas if you continue your studies, then you cannot say that, for example, I'm going to stop my studies in English and I'm going to take admission in a medical college. You can't do that. You cannot go back because you have made a choice, and whatever you do in the future depends on this choice that you made at this point in time. So although this is the path that Frost takes is one that is less traveled by, he still says that there are equal number of opportunities no matter what path you take, no matter what you're studying, you will have equal opportunities, and even if you are not going to come back, yet you can say with pride that you made a choice and you do not regret that choice. He says, I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So he says, years and years hence, if I live to tell this story, I'm going to tell other people that there was a time when I stood at a crossroads, when I saw two roads going off into the woods, Now remember, the image of the woods, Frost is using again and again to show uncertainty, to show temporariness. Whenever he says that these paths led through a wood, that wood is the world. That wood is all the trouble that you encounter in the world. So whatever path you decide to take, life is not going to be easy. Life is going to be full of troubles. Life is going to be full of problems. But you have to take care of them as you travel through this wood. As you spend your life in this world, you'll see what is right for you and what is not. You will be able to tell if you can make this choice and go ahead with it, or if you want to do something else. Whatever choice you take, it's not going to be easy, because there is the undergrowth, there are the problems in this world, there are the hindrances that human beings and that Mother Nature puts in your path. But in spite of that, you have to keep walking. You have to continue living. So when I say years and years hence to my children and my children's children, you know, once upon a time, I had this choice. And I chose to study English literature and not to go into an engineering university. And so I do not regret what I have done, or I do not regret the choice that I made at that point in time, because whatever I am today is because of that choice I made one day years and years ago. Let me take my example. There was a time when I had to make a choice, and that choice was to study science or arts, as it was called at that time. There was no humanities group. So I chose to study the arts because I love literature. And so from that time onward, my path in life was determined for me. I've had restrictions, I've had problems, but that's all a part of life. You do your degree, you want to go into teaching, you want to go into research, you go ahead and do that. And once you have made that choice, then you have to stick to it. Then there are no compromises whatsoever. So he says, whatever I am today, whatever I am, Shahina Ayub Bhatti today, is because of the choice that I made back in, what was it, 1974 or 75, when back in class 9th, which is when, you know, in the matriculation system, you get to choose whether you're going to go into science or you go into arts. So the choice that I made at that time is reflected in what I am today. Although I took the one less traveled by, that has made all the difference. That is what differentiates me from those of my friends who went on to become doctors, engineers, accountants, media specialists, etc., etc., etc. So whatever choice is made, you have to stick with that, and whatever you are ultimately in your life is determined by the choices that you make at this particular moment. What we have next is a very short poem, and with that we're going to conclude today's lesson. This poem again is by Robert Frost. It is titled Fire and Ice. And after The Road Not Taken, this is going to be slightly different, but I'm sure you're all going to enjoy it. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Now, fire and ice, two opposites, two diametrically opposite forces. The fire is heat, ice is cold. So what do you choose? Again, the situation is somewhat similar to the previous poem, that is the road not taken, with the difference that here the two roads are, one is fire, the other is ice. And you have equal number of people saying that there's going to be an ice storm and that's going to finish this world. There are people who say that because of global warming, this entire planet is going to go up in fire because the temperatures are going to increase to such an extent that we will all spontaneously self-combust. So he says, whether the world ends in fire or in ice, what my experience says is that if this world goes up in fire, that is going to be because of hatred. Because hatred, jealousy are very, very powerful tools, whereas ice, although it is cold, has some saving grace, something that that prevents total destruction of this planet. And how is that possible? Now imagine to yourself the situation. The whole world is covered with ice. If you watch movies like, let's say, something like, what was it? 2012 or The Day After Tomorrow. The Day After Tomorrow particularly, if you see, you have the entire North American continent freezing over. So coming back to Frost, Frost says that if the world were to end in ice, there is a saving grace, and that is, at some point in time, ice will melt. And when the ice melts, it will turn into water. Water is the source of life. Fire is the death of life, total annihilation. So whether this world ends in fire or in ice, the poet's personal opinion is, I, the poet, would favor ice for the simple reason that the whole planet may freeze over. But at some point in time, maybe 1,000,000 years from now, that ice will melt, turn to water, and be a source of life. Whereas, if this world were to be destroyed by fire, nothing would remain. No buildings, no greenery, no life. And once all life is finished, once all life is over and done with, there is no way you can bring it back. You always will need water for survival. Without water we die. So the continents freezing in ice for Frost are a better option than a gigantic fire breaking out, destroying entire countries, destroying all of humanity. And there's going to be no coming back then. So according to Frost, if there was a choice that was to be made, then the choice would be in favor of ice and not fire. We're going to end here. Let me quickly recap what we've done today, and then we will be done for today. We started off this lesson with a couple of poems by Emily Dickinson. Dickinson is one of those poems who did not like meeting people, but she was very, very prolific in her writing, in the sense that she wrote a lot of poems. We've selected only 3 short poems for this module. The first one is titled The Soul Selects Her Own Society, and that poem focuses on the communication that we develop with certain individuals and not with other individuals. Then the second one is Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me, and that poem focuses on death and the concept of immortality, the concept of eternal life. The third poem that we have by Dickinson is also a short poem, and it is titled Hope is a Thing with Feathers, and that talks about how important hope is for us human beings, and how that it's like a small bird which has to be nourished, it has to be taken care of, because that's the only thing that sustains us, that's the only thing that allows us to go through life without tearing each other to pieces. These 3 short poems were followed by Frost's poem The Road Not Taken, and this is the poem in which the Frost, the poet, is standing at a crossroads. He is in a wood, in a forest, and he can see 2 paths there, and that is symbolic of decisions that have to be made, choices that have to be made by human beings. And Frost the poet says that I took the path that was less traveled by, because I did not want to meet, or I didn't really want to communicate with certain people. So he says, I took the path that not many people had traveled, and that has made all the difference. That has made me today what I am. And if I had taken the other path, maybe I would have been a different person altogether. The last poem in this lesson today is a short poem also by Robert Frost, and it's titled Fire and Ice. And it sort of focuses around the end of the world, and the options again that Frost gives is 1, the world ending in fire, that is very high temperatures, a result of global warming, you can call it, and the other is everything freezing over because of the drastic change in the climate and in the temperatures. And Frost says that if I were to be given an option, I would choose destruction by ice, because there does seem to be a little hope there. The hope being that ice, when it melts, turns into water. And water is the source of life for all creatures on planet Earth. Whereas if you set fire to this world, then this world is going to, if not melt, it's going to crack up because of that dryness. So if the world has to come to an end, let it be by ice accumulating on the entire globe, and not this globe being burnt until all animal and plant life is extinct there. So in a competition with fire and ice, it's ice that Robert Frost advocates, and not destruction through fire. That's enough for today. We'll have some more in the next lecture. Thank you, and Allah Hafiz.